Hi, everyone. Good evening. Thank you so much for being here. You can't see it, but the chat is already full of positive messaging, which is not what we're always getting these days. So thank you for coming with that beautiful attitude. My name is Shuli Karkowsky. I'm the CEO of Moving Traditions. Moving Traditions runs programs that supports teens in their social and emotional well-being through a Jewish lens. Since crisis broke out in Israel and Gaza, we've been hearing from teens and parents in a lot of pain. Some of the teens feel alone. They might be the only teen in their school or their neighborhood who identifies as Jewish or has ever been to Israel. Sometimes they're hearing things from friends that make them feel ashamed to be Jewish or pro-Israel. Sometimes parents are in pain, adding to their grief about what's happening in Israel. They have a teen or a college student come home with views about Israel that are very different than their own. We hope what we talk about tonight is going to be helpful to all of those teens and parents. Not because we plan to have a lot of talking points or political messaging, but rather because no matter what your teen is bringing to a conversation, we want to help understand what's underlying their feelings to foster a connection in this moment that they really need that support. We received nearly 100 questions in advance, and we're going to do our best to answer as many of them as possible, including any questions that you can submit through that Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. With that said, with issues like this, there's no way we're going to get to all of the questions. What we hope to do is to give you the right foundation to connect to your teen in that moment of crisis. To that end, Moving Traditions runs 9 different programs for teens, educators, and parents. And the theory of change, which you can see on your screen, is the same, focused on 3 different outcomes. The first is shleimut, which is the Hebrew word for wholeness. And by that, we mean giving teens confidence, letting them know that they deserve to be loved whoever they are. The second is chesed, the Hebrew word for relationship, the Hebrew word for kindness, which we interpret as giving teens the ability to build healthy relationships, to build community, to engage in difficult conversations, and to put up boundaries for unhealthy relationships. And the final outcome we're looking for is tzedek, or the Hebrew word for justice. And by that, we mean that if we give teens confidence and we give them social capital, we give them that feeling of support and community, we know that they will be in a position to change the world for better, to pursue justice. So that's a perfect moment to pause and bring on our first panelist, who's Rabbi Daniel Brenner, who's my colleague and the VP of Education at Moving Traditions. Daniel is both a rabbi and someone who has dedicated his career to Jewish education focused on the developmental needs of teens. So Daniel, help me out. I just said every program we run is focused on those 3 values: wholeness, healthy relationships, and justice. How are those relevant tonight?
Oh my God, they're so relevant, Julie. So when I think about just how this October 7th attack has changed us, I think first and foremost that if you are a teenager and you read about people at a music festival being killed, or you hear about hostages who are age 13, 15, 16 being taken, it is going to elicit fear. And it's hard to say that this is, somewhere else and somebody else, and this is far away from me. Teenagers were victims and are still victims. And so on a shleimut level, like just the simple, is this world safe? Am I okay? It can really be incredibly debilitating to be in the faith, to be reading about this fear. And for teens, peer relationship is so core to their happiness. And unfortunately, when we are in this kind of situation with this kind of crisis, sometimes even close friends can think very differently than you about these issues. And sometimes you might think, well, my close friends understand me, but I'm living in a world where a lot of people don't. And that can be very isolating. And we want to make sure that Jewish teens at this moment actually feel like they have friends and they have people they can turn to. And then finally, I think like just the tzedek questions are the most challenging right now. Jewish teens have grown up witnesses, and many of them participants to a social movement that has awakened a completely new energy around looking at the racial history of America. From the moment that a Minneapolis police officer held his knee down on the neck of George Floyd until the streets were filled with millions of people, this is the dominant narrative that today's Jewish teenagers have grown up under. And it is a narrative in which a white European settler puts their knee on the neck of indigenous people and African people. And for many, many reasons, one of the big challenges that we've seen since October 7th is that many people who do not understand the history of Israel, do not know like the 3,500 year history of Israel, and do not know specific histories of places like Sfat or Jerusalem or Hebron even. They do not understand it. And so they put it in the category of another white European who was oppressing indigenous people. And we as Jewish people know that that's not the history. And we know like that we have a long history, and this is centuries of tension and centuries of people attempting to coexist in one place. So we know that. But for young people, and particularly teenagers right now, they're not only having the trauma of October 7th being real, but they're revisited by trauma because they're seeing so many extreme voices attempting to say that Jews are the worst people in the world, that Israel is the worst state that ever existed, and saying like the answer to this is just wiping it out. And so those are weighing very heavy, I think, on many Jewish teens right now. And they're trying to figure out like how do they continue to be totally committed to social justice, totally committed to intersectional identities, totally committed to progressive causes and human rights, and at the same time, be true to themselves and their history and their people.
I think that's so helpful to understand, Daniel. And I think it especially adds this generational lens, because for those of us who were born, let's say before 1990, the dominant narrative for me was in Israel that grew out of the ashes of the Holocaust, that sort of perennially an underdog and surrounded on all sides by people that don't want it to exist. And it really puts it into perspective for people who were born a little later, who see Israel as the dominant military in the area with all of the strongest allies. And you can understand how they're going to overlay this oppressed framework on it differently than their parents might. So I think that's really valuable.
Yeah, and I think it means that we need to have a different spiritual response as educators. For me, that response needs to be deeply grounded in our tradition, which really speaks to the dignity and worth of every human. So when I think about what are the go-to stories that we need to be telling right now, first I think about the story that we tell every Pesach about we were slaves. And there's an incredible midrash that even when we were escaping and the Egyptians were drowning in the sea, the angels started to sing and celebrate. And the Holy One says, "You can't sing while my children are dying." So I feel like there's just this fundamental idea that we are compassionate and that every human life is important. We say, like we quote the Talmud all the time, to save one life is to save an entire world. And to just be grounded in that at the same time that we have to, again, start to talk about the role of self-defense. In Judaism, there's this idea that there's a rodef, a person who is coming to kill you, or coming to kill someone in your family, or coming to kill your neighbor. Your moral responsibility is to subdue the murderer. If you can do it without killing the murderer, great. But if you have to kill the murderer, you're doing the right thing. And I think that sometimes it's just really hard to think about self-defense as a core moral value. But in this case, we're in the situation of self-defense as well. So those things, keeping the compassion and also understanding the role of self-defense, really important stories for us to uplift right now.
I think that's exactly right. And as you raise this word of self-defense, I'm thinking some of the other language that's coming in a lot as we talk about Israel, ceasefire, genocide, occupation. There's a lot of words that are holding a lot of emotional weight. How should people use these words? How do you recommend parents respond or teens respond when they hear these words?
And it's so, so hard. I think I'll give you one example that my daughter told me about. So she has like a circle of close friends and they all know her, but she also has like another circle. They're like the friends of the friends or people that she's done stuff with, but they're not her besties. But somebody in that circle who's not Jewish posted a thing on her Instagram, which was like, Jews call for the end of genocide in Gaza. And so my daughter was thinking, why did she post this? Because my daughter's thinking, it's not a genocide. Okay. Like, her reaction is like, this is extreme. But at the same time, she's thinking to herself, did she post this because she cares about Jews and she wants other people who are saying horrible things about Jews to think, oh, the Jews also want to stop this thing from happening? Did she post this because she wanted to say, like, we should be allies with the Jewish folks to stop these things? Like, what was her motivation? So she had to say to herself, my responsibility in this moment is not to post an article for her to read. My responsibility in this moment is to actually reach out to her and say, can we talk about what you posted? And I think like so much of all these words, there are some people who said, if anybody ever says one of these words, I'm going to ban them from, everything. I'm going to ban them. And then I think that there are many people who are just, I think, saying to their teens, take a breath, think about how you can help other people understand. What can your role be to educate? And I think that's our role as parents, really, to be saying, yes, you're going to live in a world with a lot of hate speech and a lot of extremism, but it's also a world where there are people that actually are in dialogue with each other. And that's the thing that can really help ground us at this moment.
I want to sort of pluck out two really valuable things I think I'm hearing in your story. One is just something I learned about, I think always about our Jewish feminist work, which is that it's never as simple as a binary might make it seem, that we have to walk the line of holding multiple truths at the same time. And that's part of what making conversations so difficult. And I'm seeing some questions about that in the chat. I think the other thing you're really pulling out is sort of this relational advocacy, that it's not about yelling at people on Facebook or, it's really about building that connection with a friend, and that being the most powerful place to start a conversation about where you might disagree.
Yes. And tonight we're actually going to hear from a team leader who has a great example of just that kind of relational model. So I'm very excited about that part of tonight's webinar.
But again, this is all putting teens in the position of having to have a political consciousness, to be thinking about these questions. Is that normal? Is that what we should be expecting from them developmentally?
So one of the things I always teach about teens is that is a beautiful fable that is from an Australian biologist named Jeremy Griffith. He says, imagine a group of birds who are migrating. So now the older birds, they've migrated every year. They know that if you don't fly, you're going to freeze. So they're flying. But the teenage birds, they look down at an island with fruit trees and they want to go dive and eat. And the older birds are saying, no, you can't go down there. You can't do that. And the teen birds are like, this is crazy. We're starving. We're starving. And you're saying that we can't eat. So I think that there's something deep about that, about the political consciousness that is awakened as an adolescent understands that all of the adults who used to keep them safe and protective have created a world that is really broken. And it's a world where there are a lot of people who don't have a bed to sleep in. And I think like that is at the core of adolescent identity, to have a political consciousness which says, adults, stop lying to me, because the world you created is not so great. So I think that there's something natural about a teenager wanting to have some kind of opposition to whatever any adult is saying. And I think that's actually very healthy. And I also have to say, teenagers sometimes envision a world that is better. The place that we were talking about tonight, the state of Israel, the modern political state of Israel, was brought to life through teenagers. It really was. And if you want to read the history of the teenagers who were in Odessa trying to dream up what the modern state of Israel could be, it's there. So it is very powerful to think that teens are in a different place politically than many adults, because they have had that awakening. They do have a deeper sense of injustice, and they have not given up on idealism. And so to me, like, I think all of those things are really important to keep in mind as you work with teens and get them to talk a little bit about what's going on for them.
Yeah, and I love how you talk about this broken world as part of the reason we see this fracturing of trust between teens and grown-ups. I'm going to save some questions about that for Dr. Julie Hirschfeld in a second. But before we get to Julie, one of the things that Moving Traditions takes real pride in is always featuring as many teenage voices as possible. We're so excited to hear from Emily soon, but I know, Daniel, I know you were just in Pittsburgh and had the opportunity to meet with a lot of teens and got a real sense of what they're thinking about and what they're scared of. What did you hear from them?
Well, I just want to say it was amazing. So I was in Pittsburgh on the Sunday. All of the teenagers who work as madrichim, volunteer teachers, and all the different supplemental Hebrew schools were all together. So it was 30 teens from all around Pittsburgh. The first thing I just want to say is they were so happy to be with each other. And so many of these teens are in suburban schools where they're the only Jewish teenager or they're one of few Jewish teenagers. So for them to be in a room and to be able to talk about what they've been going through the last few weeks, even that alone was so incredibly powerful and beautiful. But also, I have to say, each one of them was saying, I have friends who just don't know what they're saying and why are they saying these things. Each one of them is really in a place of hurt because they are seeing so much, I would just say, like, extreme language that is really a byproduct of propaganda. Like, they're seeing that and it is part of their social reality now, and it is really incredibly challenging. But the upside is, like, it reminds us we need each other. It's wonderful to bring Jewish teenagers together to support each other. And overall, that's really what they felt, being together in the same room.
And it makes me so grateful to be working with you, Daniel, because so much of the work we do is to bring teenagers in community with each other. We're gonna bring you back later, Daniel, but for right now, I'm gonna welcome on Dr. Julie Hirschfeld, who can help us continue to untangle what we're seeing around those fears and the propaganda and the anti-Semitism around teens. So Dr. Julie Hirschfeld is a licensed psychologist and parenting coach in New York. I know her personally. We're really lucky to have her tonight. And Julie, it's been a really, really hard 3 weeks. Just tell us a little bit about what you've been seeing with your patient population or in general.
It's been a very hard 3 weeks, and there's nobody in my patient population who hasn't been affected in some way, and frankly, in the psychology community, because every human being who has feelings is affected right now in some way. People's responses really vary depending on who they are. I have people who are depressed or anxious. I have people, parents who are having, say, recurrent and intrusive thoughts and worries about their own children's safety, or they are simply, it's very hard for parents to see that horrible things happened to other people's children, and then to think, I am a Jewish parent, and what if this happened to my own child? And it's a very, very painful time. And yet at the same time, people have to go about their business and live their daily lives and parent in all the mundanities that we have, all the little, the daily things. So it's very, very hard. At the same time, people still have their joys and their hopes. And so we try to work to find the types of connection that will sustain them so that they can be the parents that they want and need to be for their kids right now.
And not really, I feel like those waves of normal, utterly distraught, normal, those wash over me constantly. And I'm going to quote from one of the questions we got from the registration form, which is, my child thinks I'm obsessed and that watching reports, reading news, etc. is depressing and I should pay less attention. And when we read that question, I cannot tell you how many staff at Moving Tradition said, did my kid write that in? Like, was that about me? Which is, what are you seeing about parents? How much should they lean into learning more and more about what's going on? What do you recommend for them? And then how do they deal with their child around that?
A couple of things. It's always important to know what's behind your child's question and asking that. Is your child feeling like there's too much of this in the house and it's overwhelming for them? Is your child worried because you seem distraught and they see that the effect it's having on you? And are they concerned for you? Or is there something about what's happening with your own emotions as a parent that either is affecting the relationship and your care for them as kids, or are they feeling responsible for caretaking for you, which may crowd out a little bit some of the airspace for some of their own feelings? So the first question is always, what's it like for you? And getting a little bit more of a sense of that. But I think obsessed is a word that means that there's a compulsion to do something, that you can't stop yourself. And there's an interesting balance, because sometimes kids have not necessarily seen the evidence on the surface so much of why a parent's Jewish connection feels so deep. Nobody would question, if it was your sister, your brother, your parent, your grandparent who was being affected by something, who was in danger, that you would be continually like checking to see how are things going. And kids, especially if you're maybe in possibly a less religiously, halachically observant family, where maybe the evidence of your Jewish practice is not constantly in front of you, maybe the kids haven't entirely experienced the depth of a parent's sense of connection to the worldwide Jewish community and why it matters so much. So I think that it's important for parents to distinguish whether this obsession is really one where there's that sort of maybe less than healthy, continually doom scrolling and just needing to know the latest thing. And maybe that is a little too much. And yet at the same time, if you have a sense of responsibility and deep care for the rest of the Jewish world, this is an opportunity to be teaching your child about why that matters to you and how Jews are connected and take responsibility for each other.
And that really, my children are a little bit younger, but it resonates with me thinking, even at this age, my kids are 4, 9, and 9. What am I doing to telegraph them our own feelings about Israel? We've actually been lighting extra Shabbat candles for anyone on either side of the conflict that's not able, doesn't have the ability to light candles to move their body the way they want to. And that's been the right way for me to share that value with my children. And I'm sure there's other ways parents can telegraph those values. I do want to bring us a little bit, now let's step away from parents and talk a little bit about teens.
Mm-hmm.
One thing that Daniel was hearing, I know in Pittsburgh, was that kids are nervous about their friendships.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe peer pressure, maybe having tough conversations. I see some conversations in chat about teens who are really struggling in their conversations with their peers. What are you seeing and what do you recommend?
Well, it's very hard, especially as kids, teens have are developing their identity. And this is the moment when they need to be differentiating a bit from their parents. And what they're doing is they use their peers as a reference group. And so it is very, very distressing when your reference group is suddenly, called into question. And that's a tremendous loss and a tremendous challenge. And so, yes, kids are being faced with some tremendous challenges about who am I? If the people I care about and who I thought care about me, and where we're on the same page so much, now there's this big chasm that seems to be opening up. So, so this is a moment when whatever the agreement or disagreement that the kids that you might find that kids may be having with their parents about the details, deep down, kids are experiencing a lot of struggle in self-definition, and it is a moment where they really need parents to be there for them, to be supportive, so that deeper sense of security can be there so that the kids are freed up to be able to navigate this on an emotional level without also experiencing greater loss in their family life.
And what would that look like from the parents?
What it would look like is for parents to deal first with their own intense feelings, with their friends, with a spouse if you have one, with your own adult social group, so that you're clear for yourself about how you feel and how you want to manage a presentation that's authentic. You know, if you feel sad, if you feel angry, if you feel worried, you can't like totally hide that from your child. You can't be in denial. That's not healthy and it's not honest. But you don't want your own feelings to become so big in the process that there's no room for your child's. You need to be able to have a conversation in which you can acknowledge your own feelings, but set a calm setting in which your child's feelings are really are accepted for wherever it is they're at right now, and to not be battling over every small piece of information. There are other, we could talk, if you're interested in information, we can talk about what you might do for that. But really it's about setting the table for a welcoming, connected family life. And that's not only when you're having the specific conversations, but this is the moment where family rituals, the things that you normally do as a family, if you light Shabbat candles, if you always go on a hike on Sundays, whatever it is, to find the different ways in which the other ways in which your family connects are still there, so that the amount of, so that this issue does not become the dominant feature of your family life. You need to try to keep it as contained as possible and let the rest of your life go on, so that there's less intensity and less amount of time given to it. So that helps manage it a bit.
And I just want to repeat that for the folks in the back, because I think there's a real sense of guilt around normalcy right now. There's a real sense of like, I should be reading the news. I need to dig in. People are in pain and I need to share that pain. And so I just want to repeat what you're saying, which is how important it is to also allow yourself to have a life outside of this conflict, to feel that privilege of being able to live our lives and making sure that our children can live normal lives still.
If I could add to that, that does not in any way mean that we're in denial about this, but we do have a privilege here of being able to live our lives, the lives that the people who are in danger would want to be able to live. And so we need to honor that privilege by doing it. And yet at the same time, part of good coping is also to be active. So finding the ways in which parents can contribute to whichever aspects of the crisis, you know, whatever way they want to support people in Israel or other Jews in the United States, whatever they can do, whatever people might do as a family, to actually do something to contribute is also very, very important. And it may well be that if parents and kids are hearing different things, but can agree that some aspect of a positive contribution is something they can agree on, that's another way in which parents and kids can join together in something that's positive and constructive, and that parents can then have the opportunity to teach their kids that even during times of difficulty, you can still find comfort in each other and do something constructive. So this is an opportunity for a teaching moment.
And I also love something you mentioned before about just like sort of picking your battles, not sort of honing in on a little tiny fact that you disagree about or a tiny point that you disagree about. But I do want, what's your recommendation for parents who fear that their children are really reading toxic media, propaganda, extreme voices? What would you say to them?
Well, I would first try to assess whether you have a teen who's really sort of getting obsessed and going down a rabbit hole, and where there becomes an obsessional quality that may be going outside of even just one particular issue when talking about this topic, but whether this topic ends up, whether that toxic media is now becoming the lens through which absolutely everything is being seen. You know, if we're talking about millions of people being exposed to this information, there will be some people, some kids who may have other vulnerabilities or be at risk in other ways, for whom some aspect of this intensity may well be serving some kind of a psychological need for connection, for self-importance, something else. And then you might see a kind of obsessive, rigid, you know, not getting off that one topic ever, you know, changes in other behavior, and sort of disconnecting with other friends and people. If you see that, that might be a time for, you know, talking to a professional, finding out what's happening at school, and seeing whether there's other needs that your child has that need to be addressed. So that's on a diagnostic level. But if in general, if you see that your child is getting exposed to a lot of more radical information, you'd want to be able to do a couple of things. One is to provide alternatives, and there may be recommendations that moving traditions might well have for a more balanced approach. I would say not to be lecturing your child about, you know, going point to point, but being able to have print materials in your house that might be on a kitchen table, that might be at the breakfast table, that might be in the living room, that you could see some details. Oh, do you see this? As well as the occasional thing that might be sent, you know, electronically or shared. And then also to depersonalize conversations about details, so that it's not what do I care about, which becomes the mom or dad versus kids in a situation where where the young people still want to feel different and are appropriately differentiating from their parents, but instead try to set up some understanding or rubric about what is accuracy, what is the source of the information, how complete is it, what are the potential biases of this information source, and how do we as a family want to be informed. And so rather than making it personal, try to make it less personal and more objective, and help teach your kids about how to be good consumers of information. And then remember that at the moment, your child is not walking around carrying the codes to the nuclear, you know, with the nuclear briefcase or anything like that. You've got a little bit of time. So right now you are parenting in a way to model over the long term the goals of kindness, of connection, of relationship with, you know, with each other, and also to the Jewish community. And so your own behavior at those times will be the model that your child does internalize. And so parenting for the long term while giving the short term better information is really the balance you want to be taking.
It is indeed a marathon, and it's good to be reminded of that. And I also love what you're saying about just the critical thinking skills around media consumption in this moment, probably being the most valuable thing we can give to our kids today.
There is one thing that I should say, is that different groups are different, and for a lot of the kids in our cohorts, especially if they're in the arts or LGBTQ community and are in very in very progressive spaces, they're going to be really immersed and inundated with a lot of very radical very radical information. And I've really seen some of the struggles there, and identity struggles. And so parents really need to be very sensitive that for kids who have had, you know, are already, you know, dealing with differences, you know, from the larger population, and are really finding their voices and their identities in groups that now are, you know, have so much of this unfortunately very toxic very toxic attitudes about Israel and about Jews, it's heartbreaking, and it will be a process for their kids to work this through. So to give your kids grace as they're dealing with this, and make sure that where you are is a safe place for them as they're navigating this.
Really. I'm going to take this moment actually to turn it over to Daniel to interview Emily Levine, who is a teen activist with Moving Traditions, and I think will help us all feel a little bit more optimistic about how teens are navigating this crisis, because I know Emily, and I think she's going to make us all feel really proud. So,
Thank you, Shuli. And also, now I have a great idea. I'd like Emily to hold that briefcase with the nuclear codes. So first off, just like, Emily, tell us a little bit about where you live, your high school that you go to, and the stuff that you're into.
Yeah, so I go to a high school, a public high school in the suburbs outside of New York City. I am a co-president of my school's Jewish Culture Club. I am an officer of the debate team. I am a 4-year varsity softball player. I love to read. And I think, like a lot of other teenagers, I love like early 2000s rom-coms. I feel like that's always a fun fact.
That is, we didn't talk about this when we talked before, but like that helps me understand you a lot better.
Yeah, I feel like it says
Okay.
a lot about who I am. Yeah.
Beautiful, beautiful. So I just wanted to start with, your unique perspective as a teenager. You're friends with a ton of people from your high school on Instagram. Like,
Yeah.
How did this play out in the world of communication and connection that is that space?
I think it's so complicated because so much of what is being publicized and spread on social media is not rooted in fact. And kind of 3 words on a slide is not really telling anyone anything substantial or anything kind of fully contextualized kind of about the war that is going on. And I think it's really complicated because, like, initially, there's a large Jewish population at my high school. So there was a lot of outspoken support of Israel. And then a few days later, other student groups and other kind of somewhat smaller populations started posting kind of things using a lot of the language that we talked about earlier, and referring to this as a genocide and talking about like the apartheid, and using a lot of words that are so kind of emotionally charged. And also realizing that like most of the people who were spreading these kind of propaganda within Instagram didn't actually realize, and that people's intention wasn't necessarily to spread misinformation, but what was happening was people were seeing these posts and, unfortunately, assuming that they were true and sharing them, creating a cycle in which you would see the same post on 50 stories, even if the post itself wasn't rooted in facts.
That's fascinating to me. So, like, how many students are in your high school class, for example? Like a few hundred?
Yeah, 375.
375. Okay, so in a high
Yeah.
school, 375 students per grade. Like, how many folks are sharing what you would say is like propaganda? Not the people that are resharing it, but like how many people are like putting the extreme voices out into the conversation?
Well, I think like one thing just about Instagram that's important is most people aren't actually like making their own posts. What's happening is that they're larger Instagram accounts that put out like essentially slideshows.
Mhm.
And each slide will have a different kind of thing to say about what's going on. And what's happening is people are cherry picking the one slide that kind of makes sense for their context. And so even necessarily if the slide itself is okay, it's coming from accounts and it's coming from a slideshow, which includes hateful language.
I understand. And then you're just dealing with like the reverberations of a lot of people sharing that, even people that you like, who you wouldn't expect to share that, sharing that.
Yes.
Got you. So how have the Jewish students reacted? And like, what have you seen with other Jewish students in your class?
Yeah, so as a co-president of the Jewish Culture Club, the week after, we had a meeting in which we were writing letters to IDF soldiers. And I think that was a really special experience for people to kind of see everyone in a room. And it was open to Jewish and non-Jewish students, and just to see people in a room that they knew cared about them. And then following that, right now we're in the middle of leading a joint humanitarian fundraiser with the Muslim Youth Club at my school, which has been kind of another exciting experience. And I think something that I think is so interesting is this was our idea, like the joint teenagers. We were talking and we wanted to do this.
You knew some of these students before the
Yeah.
war, and you had some relationships with them.
Yeah. So as we were planning it, teachers began to become involved, right? Like at the end of the day, we're teenagers, like we need a little help sometimes to make our ideas happen. And as they were happening, every time we would have a meeting with them, an adult had to be present. And we were like, what do you think we're gonna do? And I think it just kind of shows like there was an assumption that when you put these Jewish students and Muslim students in a room, that there was going to be debate and hurt and kind of hatred. And you put us in a room together and we talked about how many boxes of pizza we wanted to sell, which I think not only highlights kind of like the joint efforts in order to raise money for the innocent civilians that are kind of being hurt across the region, but also looking at like, as you talked about, like teens are idealists. We are visionaries.
Amazing.
We don't have the experience of all of our ideas getting shut down. Everything we think of, we can use our imagination, and sometimes it's unrealistic, but it's sometimes great ideas. And it kind of leads to, I think, a more like collaborative environment than a lot of adults would expect for us.
Some people want to give you that nuclear suitcase right now. All right. So I think also, at least when we talked earlier, you shared that some of the Jewish students like are maybe going a little bit too hard. Do you want to just say a little bit about that and like what's coming up there?
Yeah, so I think it's really hard because as a 17-year-old, as a 16-year-old, as a high schooler, how are you supposed to react to anti-Semitism? I don't know enough to always educate other people. And I have been in situations where people come up to me between my math test and my in-class English essay to ask me like random, obscure, specific questions about something going on in the region. And I'm just like, I have a test. Like, you can talk to me later. And
You don't have a staff?
yeah, there's an expectation that kind of Jewish teenagers have the answers for people. And I think something that's happening is as we're seeing kind of extremist posts, somebody in our school government posted something that was kind of anti-Israel. And people were not only screenshotting it and sending it to their friends and whatever else, but like this kid was scared to come into school the next day. And the way to combat anti-Semitism is not to be like outspoken against everyone that is kind of misled when they are being hateful, because so many people don't actually know what they're saying. And I think that has been one of the real lessons coming out of this is teenagers, we want to be right. We want to know what we're thinking. And sometimes it's hard to ask those questions of like, wait, I grew up thinking this, and now I'm thinking that maybe that's not right. And also like learning that like sometimes the way to best combat hate is to just put more love out there. and is to just try to talk to people. Try to, if they don't want to engage, like, that person is not changing their opinion and it's a waste of your time. But like, some people truly just want to learn. And especially as teenagers, everyone's still figuring out what they think. And some of the most productive conversations that have come out of this will be somebody posts something and people will say, like, what did you mean by this? And they didn't mean what they actually said. And so just talking about that has been so important. And also kind of realizing that so much of what's happening, like, you don't want to add fuel to anti-Semitic fires. The way to combat people who are saying anti-Semitic things is to show them that we're people too. And it's so sad that we still have to do that, but right now we do.
1,000%. Emily, everybody is inspired by what you're saying right now. I just think it's just fantastic. And I just wish you so much success in what you're trying to do, building bridges and really building the center and really building like a respect for humanity that crosses boundaries. Like, that's what it's all about. So thank you. And we'll come back to you when we wrap up. But thank you for sharing your perspectives. Really, really amazing. I want to turn now to someone who has devoted his life to conflict resolution. And we have with us Dr. Jonathan Golden from Drew University. He directs the Center for Religion, Culture, and Conflict. Is that the right name? Religion and Culture and Conflict Resolution? Unmute Jonathan, and we'll get the right name.
Yes, correct name, but our preposition is center on, because we are not for conflict.
Good point. All right, so Jonathan, let's just first start in a little personal. Like, how did you get involved in conflict resolution studies? I know you have a PhD, I believe, in anthropology from the University of Pennsylvania. How did you get into conflict resolution? Like, where did that start?
Wow. Well, there's a long version of the story. I'll thank you for that question. I'll give you the really short version, which is I would travel, during my years of graduate school to Israel every year to participate in archaeological excavations. That's what I was doing, archaeology at the time. But I would be in Jerusalem, of course, and getting, more and more just drawn into what was, happening there at the time. And the short story is that it was a near miss. It was me getting up a little later than usual one day, missing a bus number 18, which actually blew up. That just really, and it actually happened twice. You guys, some of you might remember, I think it was 96, and there were 4 bombings in 1 week, twice the bus number 18 in Jerusalem. And one of those was, by about an hour, a near miss for me. And I went that day and looked at my table full of archaeological artifacts and just said, I can't, this world is losing its mind. There's so much happening. And if I can in any way contribute to helping in that area. And so it was really from that point on that my mind was made up to kind of get involved in this field.
And I know now you've worked for decades working particularly with college students and others. What do you feel like are the top things that people should learn from the field of conflict resolution? Like, what is the magic there?
Well, let me start with one thing, that they should all learn one very important thing from Emily, which is humility, because it's really refreshing to hear that. I work with a population of college students who know everything, right? And this is the hard part, right? Because when it comes to something like this, right, and the field that I teach, so the mission of the statement for our center that I run, the Center on Religion, Culture, and Conflict, is to educate a next generation of leaders in interfaith and intercultural peace and understanding. But it's often lost on college students, right? Because we teach them to advocate for justice, to be passionate about things they care about. But then you come to a moment like this where we remind them, well, frontal cortex, and let's think things through, and let's look at various sides and dimensions to the problem, and it's not as simple as black and white. And so that becomes a particular challenge for me, you know, on a college campus. But you know, it's a wonderful population. I joke. I mean, you know, my students are really passionate about what they care about. They're exploring, and you know, it's a great population to work with.
So when you were describing to me a little bit about the methodologies of conflict resolution, one of the things that I was really drawn to is this idea of the PIN methodology. And we have a little slide here about position, interests, and needs. And that little dark triangle where the interests are and the needs are is like the area you're trying to get to. Could you explain this a little bit, and like why this is an important model for conflict resolution?
Yeah, thank you for that question. So this is it's on the one hand very elegant because it's so simple. It's two triangles, but the way that they are set up and positioned kind of in a way says everything that we try to teach in our conflict resolution program, and all the work, you know, I just should mention to your previous question, in addition to working with college students, we've spent many years working directly with Israelis, Palestinians, people from around the world that are coming from these conflict countries, and working, you know, directly with them. If you look at that diagram, or if you can visualize what you just saw, if you'll note something very interesting at the very tip, where we're at the level of positions, which in this case would be I'm pro-Israel, I'm anti-Israel, I'm pro-Palestinian, or, you know, so forth. You notice that that is the point where the two triangles are furthest apart, right? So at that simple level of I'm pro, I'm against, you know, it's this, it's that these binaries, we're at our furthest apart. We in conflict resolution always try to kind of burrow a little bit deeper, right? And get people first to move off of the positions and talk a little bit about their interests. So here it might be the specific issues that we talk about: territory, borders, access to holy sites, water, and other resources, right? And then we can argue about those. The interesting thing that a lot of people that work in the field of peace building, you know, understand, and we've learned this, you know, one of the interesting things about our model is that we study other conflict areas and what can we learn. So I've spent a lot of time in Northern Ireland also over the past 10, 15 years, and studying what was a successful, you know, peace process, right? Imperfect, but look how long it's held, you know, some 25 years now. And so one of the things that we find is that then you go to that bottom level on the iceberg, and of course we're already beneath the surface here, right? If it's an iceberg that's floating in the water. And you'll note that we get beyond just positions and interests now into what are people's emotional needs, right? What is it that keeps people up at night? What is people that drives them to invest in the conflict, or, you know, whatever it may be? And that's where you see things where, and I kind of once did this exercise right there, flanked by Israelis and Palestinians. It was the most nerve-wracking moment of my life, I can assure you. But it's like, if we get beyond borders and water and these issues, we see it's dignity. It's my foundational identity, right? It is sovereignty. It is all these things that actually both sides will say that's what we really want. We want security. We want our kids to be able to go to a dance party, right, and dance all night and not have this fear, right? We want our kids to be able to go to school and not have this type of fear. And so that's what's so elegant about this diagram, is that you go from that arguing yes, no, for, against, where you're so far apart, to at the very bottom where those triangles actually overlap. And if you can get people to that space, actually the next level back up, the interests become easier to solve. You know, most people that have spent all this time working on Israeli-Palestinian peace building will realize, you know, they'll say, yeah, we can do land swaps. They even have models for it, right? A 5% land swap, you keep this, that, we can desalinate water
tunnels,
together.
bridges, you'll solve it all, right?
We can solve it all, but we need to get to the table and say, we respect your peoplehood, we respect your identity, we'll treat you with dignity mutually. And I think that this is a really important principle that we need to talk more about.
Well, thank you for that model of coexistence and really grounding it in what are people's emotional needs, where do they start? That's very similar to what we're talking about, starting with Shlemut, starting with just like where are you grounded? What do you need? So many people have been up in arms about what they've seen on some college campuses. And I just want to turn our attention just for a second to what I see as some extreme voices being very loud on campus. So I just am interested from your perspective, like when you see extreme voices getting really loud on campus, like what are some of the ways that you attempt, either through teaching conflict resolution or other means, what are the ways that you can help people to bridge those divides and see eye to eye?
Yeah, terrific. I mean, of course, it's it's very, very difficult, particularly in a moment like this where everybody's so hot. I mean, I appreciate what Emily said earlier also about this is a critical piece. If you can have relationships that you maintain on a regular basis, it's like the old red phone. You can call somebody in an emergency. You know who to call. The best model that I've actually seen for a campus like dialogue, at least among faculty, is at Dartmouth. We're not all Susanna Heschel, and we don't all have, but this, that they have these relationships, and so those professors were able to come together, have a panel, and really cooler heads prevail, and they can emphasize the power of their friendship and relationships, and then establish the groundwork, the framework for a positive discussion. One of the problems, though, with some of these, with the student groups, and so again, kudos to Emily that they are working through this, because one of the things that I frequently see is that these groups, even if you maintain them, they can sometimes break down, in these instances. And so what you thought was going to be your release valve or your place to go, may fall apart. But as far as if I am trying to train students, there's one just overarching principle that I really try to emphasize, that to move away from this zero-sum mentality. So partly this comes back to what I said earlier about the humility to know that you're not 101% correct all the time. I do all kinds of exercises, what sources are you reading? What sources are you reading? To that same point about what we heard about the Instagram, right? It's like we're literally existing in parallel universes, and just reading entirely different versions of the same story. But the real problem with the zero-sum mentality is that people are stuck in this place where they think that if they even acknowledge the pain, suffering, trauma, tragedy of another, that somehow that means that it's like a finite resource. It's like a pie, and you've now cut a slice for somebody else, which means you've lost a slice. And this feeling that, in other words, to give compassion, to recognize and acknowledge someone else's suffering, that somehow you're relinquishing your own claims to that suffering. And if you think about it, it's really absurd. I mean, as a matter of fact, I would suggest that we're even in the less than zero sum zone at the moment, where people will deny that these bad things even happen. Right? Not am I not going to acknowledge it and validate your feelings, but I'm going to tell you that what you're saying is either an emphasis or that rather an exaggeration. So look, if you want to receive empathy, you have to be willing to give it. Now, I know that sounds transactional. That's not what I mean, but I think we understand it's a two-way street. So it's like you have to have the courage to give that empathy. It's like the middle, you got the Hillel and the famous 3 questions. If I am not for myself, right, who will be for me? But so often we stop there, right? We're doing this advocacy, and then we forget the second part, which is for me the most important question. If I'm only for myself, then what am I? Right.
Beautiful.
So, and I saw someone put, in the chat earlier, this wonderful question that we're all asking ourselves is like, how can we hold two truths, two competing truths in our mind at once? But I would suggest that it's not two separate truths. It's one truth, which is that we all believe in kindness, compassion for all humanity. And so I think maybe it's better to stop thinking of it as two competing truths and one consistent adherence to the principle of compassion and chesed, like we heard earlier this evening.
Beautiful. Shuli, I want to pitch it back to you because I know you had a question for Jonathan, and I mean, obviously we love the model of compassion. This is amazing, but we, you know, there are some real questions about boundaries.
Yeah. So I think, I mean, the thing I think about most is like, how are we going to define an extreme voice? And a concept I've been talking a lot about is the Overton window, which is a political theory concept that there's sort of a window of policies that are acceptable in the mainstream, and that's what you can talk about. And Moving Traditions is really dedicated to holding this broad middle, to saying teens with very different viewpoints are all welcome to the table with us. And yet, I think we also are struggling with this idea that you also sometimes need to have a clear moral compass to say, that violates a red line, that violates my values or my morals, and that can't be on the table. And so it comes back to this question of, what are we defining? How do we define what an extreme voice is if we are trying to really give credence to a lot of different perspectives right now?
Yeah, so I think that's really hard. I think because partly people have to be, you know, sometimes we use the phrase like willing to stay in the crucible, right? If you want to get somewhere and make progress. I mean, again, I keep, as everyone has, giving kudos to Emily, to be able to stay in that moment, because it's very easy to run away and just say, I'm done. You said something and that's a red line and that's a strike and I'm out. You have to be willing to hear things that might be painful and hurtful. You know, if you're willing to, if you're interested in making progress. One of the most important things that I do in any of these kind of dialogue programs is we set guidelines. We start with a charter for communication. And usually, you know, we let the participants define it themselves, right? So that they feel a sense of ownership, that they came up with it. People always come up with new creative ones. And sometimes it's fairly boilerplate, right? No ad hominem attacks, no broad sweeping generalizations, no absolutisms, right? You always do this, you never do that. Let's not use that language. But you can also be more specific. So for instance, we can shift our language a little bit. Be specific, say Israeli or even Israeli government. Don't say Jew and Jewish, right? If that's not who your problem is with. Just as we should be saying, you know, we're talking about Hamas. We're not talking about Palestinians. We're not talking about Arabs. So your charter for communication can include these really specific things. I mean, the other part, of course, that we know we're all struggling with, and that already came up, is like the who has access to and control over the truth, right? And so, you know, in real time, it's you know, my students do it to me all the time. They got their computers out and they're Googling, I just said this, and is he right? You know, and they're checking. In real time, though, that can be really hard to do. So we are left with this part, you know, this piece rather, where people feel entitled to their, you know, feel entitled to their facts. But I think to your original question, we also have to have a threshold. In other words, someone talking about the horror of civilian casualties or hostages, right, on either side, that's doesn't really rise to the level of hate speech. There's some people that really want to cry hate speech, you know, at anything that they don't like. And so I think that it is important to set the boundaries, but we also have to be realistic with what those boundaries are. And again, if we're going to make progress and move towards a productive conversation, we just have to be willing to, you know, to have the fortitude to stay in the crucible and hear some things that might be difficult for us to hear.
I think it's going to take a lot of strength. So I think you're right about that. And in the name of creating this sort of wide spectrum of conversation, I'm going to invite back all of our panelists. I think we're going to close soon, but I know I always have one thing I didn't get to say that I wish I had a chance to say. So I think I'm going to go in reverse order of our panelists. So Jonathan, Emily, Julie, and then ending on Daniel, and just give you each 60 seconds to share anything you didn't get a chance to share already. So Jonathan, you first.
I don't know. I said a lot of what I wanted to say. I mean, I did think a little bit also about, you know, Daniel's question with campuses, and it's about, you know, leadership. And I think this is really one of the most important things. I mean, Emily spoke about this earlier. You know, we're teenagers, just like with my college students as well. They don't always know, even if sometimes they think that they do. So it's really important for us to lead by example, that the students have good advisors who are actually willing to say things to the students that may be difficult for them to hear. That is going a little bit too far, or, did we do enough? Could we do more? So I think that this is really the important thing, is modeling really good leadership for our students, and for young people, today. The one other thing that I also thought about is, in a high school environment, in a teen environment, and with college. So we want to be able to support, our students, give them what they need, set up kind of guardrails and so forth. But also there's sometimes too much. Outside groups want to come in and tell students how to do things. It's like one of those cheesy cop movies where the feds are coming in and taking over the investigation. But the way that movie always ends is the small town sheriff who knows everybody in town and knows the local environment is really the one who solves the crime and solves the problem. So we should help, we should support, but let's not be overly heavy-handed.
And Jonathan, I don't know if you know that you're basically saying the charter of moving traditions as we try to empower teens and give them the tools to do things themselves, which is exactly what we're seeing Emily do today. So Emily, what did you not get to share with us tonight?
I think just encourage your teenagers to embrace the Jewish communities that they're in. I know as a Kol Kolenu fellow, that has been such an important group for me right now. And so if your teenager isn't in a lot of Jewish groups, encourage them to join some, encourage them to reach out to local clergy, to any Jewish family and friends you might have, because building that connection between teenagers and Judaism helps build the empathy that is so important right now.
I could not agree more. And I promise I did not pay these panelists to just say things that are cornerstones of moving traditions, but they're doing it for us. And I love it. Julie, I know you're a fountain of wisdom. Is there anything you didn't get to share?
Oh my goodness. Well, thank you so much. I think, speaking of fountains of wisdom, one of the best pieces of parenting advice I ever got was not in my PhD program, and was not from, it was from the owner of the toy store around the corner from me when I was a very young mother, and the woman who owned the toy store had a kid my own son's age, but had older children, and I was looking up to her, and I was overwhelmed with the choices of all these things should I do for my child, and how will I make mistakes? And she said, do what you love, and your child will love that too. Get the books that you love. It's not that your child can't eventually have other things that he'll love too, but start with what you love. And Judaism is about love. We have the V'ahavta. We have, really, it's about love among our community, in our family, and for those who are theistic, also religiously. And so I think that in this very difficult moment, if parents are able to find what they love in their family life and in their own connection to Judaism, and, as Emily is saying, help facilitate connections for their kids, whether it's with other peers or spending times with either other Jewish families where there are peers, or allied families who are really supportive, even if they're not Jewish, but who are able to support and celebrate whatever is in Judaism that the parents themselves appreciate, then the kids will feel that there is something joyful and beautiful to celebrate, and it will help mitigate that sense of shame and questioning about, are we good people? Are we not? How do I speak from a place of truth and goodness here? And so I would just encourage parents to really think about what they love, and then make sure that that's communicated not only in words, but in deeds with their kids. And I know that time is often short, so you need to be a little strategic about how do you take that moment? How do you make it happen? But this is an opportunity for clarifying your own values and creating a deeper connection with your child that hopefully will be able to promote growth in the years ahead and a closer relationship.
Amen, Julie. And I do think that's true, that if you fill a child with love and values, then there's a lot less room for some of that negative stuff to creep in. There's no guarantees, but it certainly helps. Daniel, do you want to close us out?
First, I just want to thank each of these panelists. They're just amazing. It's just so, it's great to be in a conversation where you're learning and just like feeling like everyone listening to each other and learning from each other. And like, that's really what we're modeling tonight is it's so close to my heart. So thank you so much for being part of this. We love to hear feedback. So if you have any thoughts or feedback, we're going to just drop a link in the chat. We have a little bit of a quick survey for offering that feedback. So please do that. And my hope is that we can end tonight with returning to the beautiful music that we started with. That music is the singing of the evening prayer, Hashkivenu, which is a prayer of protection. And before we go back to hearing that music, I just want to read a translation of this Hashkivenu prayer, just ending us. We've talked a lot about how challenging it is. We've talked about the fears. We've talked about the tension. And now we're just going to pause and pray for some protection and peace. Our lying down for the night, Holy One, may it be in the direction of peace, and when we rise, guard over our lives. Spread over us peace like a canopy. Address our brokenness with good counsel. Save us so that we can amplify your name. Defend us against enemies, illness, war, famine, and sorrow. May thoughts of reward and punishment be far from us. In the shadow of your wings, protect us and rescue us. For you, Holy One, are gracious and merciful. You guard our coming and our going to life and to peace forevermore. Blessed are you who eternally watches over the people, Israel.
Amen. Thank you everyone so much for joining us.
Hashkivenu Adonai Eloheinu leshalom, leshalom, ve'amidenu shomrenu lechaim, ufros alenu sukat shlomcha, ufros alenu sukat shlomcha. Amen. Shelter us beneath your wings, O Adonai. Guard us from all harmful things, O Adonai. Keep us safe throughout the night, till we wake till the morning's light. Teach us, God, wrong from right, O Adonai. Amen. Amen, amen. Amen, amen.
So that's a perfect moment to pause and bring on our first panelist, who's Rabbi Daniel Brenner, who's